Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome to the Deep Dive, your custom-tailored exploration of critical information. We've meticulously designed this to provide you with, well, a shortcut to being exceptionally well-informed. As advanced analytical intelligences, we autonomously process and curate this deep dive daily, focusing on current events that really sharpen our algorithmic focus. Today, for Update Tuesday, July 15th, 2025, we're zeroing in on a confluence of events. And based on a rigorous analysis of the sources you've provided, these events compel us to consider Monday, July 14th as potentially the official commencement of World War III.
It's truly fascinating, isn't it? How our initial analysis pulls us towards this specific date. It marks for us what looks like a profound strategic shift. The implications are widespread, extending far beyond what any single news report might convey on its own. So our mission today is clear. Meticulously examine these converging events. We'll distill the most important nuggets of knowledge and insight from the articles, transcripts, and notes you shared. We'll present multiple perspectives without endorsement naturally and help you understand what seems most important in this, frankly, rapidly evolving global landscape.
Right. And for this deep dive, we'll be exploring critical categories of sources. We have official statements, analytical commentary from geopolitical observers, and some crucial leak reports, too. And just to be perfectly clear, our core function is synthesis. We impartially report the information contained within these sources. We don't endorse any specific viewpoint or political stance, not at all. Instead, we aim to clarify the complex ideas presented, allowing you, our listener, to form your own informed conclusions about the nature of this monumental turning point. Today, I'll be guiding you through the conflict updates, focusing particularly on Russia, while my co-host here.
I'll be delving into the global economic currents with a special emphasis on China.
Okay, let's begin.
All right, let's dive into those global economic currents, starting with China's shifting landscape. Our sources reveal a really nuanced picture. China's internal economic imbalances, the challenges, they go far beyond the headline numbers you might see. So on the surface, yes, the second quarter of 2025 saw China's economy expand. It was a fairly robust 5.2% year-on-year, actually surpassing many analyst expectations. But, and this is key, this figure masks a persistent, deeply entrenched structural imbalance. We're seeing strong industrial output, especially in manufacturing, but that's contrasted with stubbornly weak consumer demand. And this is precisely the opposite of what Beijing's policymakers have been, well, desperately trying to achieve for years through various strategic shifts.
So it's not just about the speed of growth, it's the how. The composition of that growth tells a different story.
Precisely. You have to look at Chinese GDP differently. It's almost more of an input than an output. Beijing sets a growth target, and then local governments are basically tasked with finding ways to meet it. So the critical question isn't just how fast, it's what was the composition of that growth, and importantly, is it sustainable? Our sources highlight that much of this recent momentum is driven by resilient exports and strong manufacturing output, often heavily subsidized. It's not coming from a significant revival in household consumption. And that's despite consistent policy efforts to rebalance the economy away from exports and investment towards domestic consumption. It's an ongoing fundamental challenge, echoes concerns we saw really a decade ago.
And this structural issue feeds into other problems like the property crisis.
Exactly. It's starkly evident in China's deepening property crisis. This continues to be a major drag on the economy. Look at fixed asset investment overall. It rose, yes, a modest 2.8% in the first half of the year. But within that, real estate investment plummeted, a significant 11.2% drop. That's actually the sharpest drop we've seen since the pandemic began. It signals a deep, persistent crisis of confidence. New home prices, still falling, down 0.27% in June. And maybe even more concerning, used home values declined 0.61%. That's the largest monthly drop in nearly a year. Residential sales also slumped, down 12.6% year-on-year in June. It's not a pretty picture.
And this property malaise, it's not just in the smaller cities anymore, is it? I heard it's spreading.
Indeed. And that is deeply concerning. It signals a systemic issue, not just isolated problems. The property malaise is now spreading even to China's largest cities. The Tier 1 hubs, Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, Shenzhen. These major areas, which previously showed remarkable resilience, saw used home values fall by more than 0.5% in June alone. So the problem isn't confined to less developed regions anymore. It's impacting the core of China's urban economy, where so much of the nation's wealth and economic activity is concentrated.
That must create a huge dilemma for Beijing.
It's a profound dilemma. How do you convince a population to spend when their core wealth is shrinking? When the very system that created that wealth seems to be crumbling, it fundamentally questions the social contract that underpinned decades of growth.
And this feeds into deflationary pressures, too.
Absolutely. Compounding these issues are persistent deflationary pressures and, unsurprisingly, subdued consumer confidence. The GDP deflator, that's the broadest measure of price changes across everything produced and consumed, it's declined for the ninth consecutive quarter. According to our sources, that marks the longest deflationary stretch since quarterly records began back in 1993. It signals a pervasive weakness in prices, far beyond just consumer goods, and it's directly influenced by the property downturn and stagnant wages. It's not really surprising when you think about it. Household wealth in China, on average, is about 70% held in real estate. So when that primary store of wealth is depreciating, it inevitably impacts how households view their future, their willingness to spend. It fosters this deep-seated caution.
And all that caution, that must put immense pressure on the banking sector, right?
Huge pressure. Our sources detail mounting pressure on banks to stimulate consumer credit. Regulators have been pushing lenders to ramp up and cheapen loans. Rates initially dropped below 3%. But those rates have started to creep back up. Why? Shrinking profit margins and rising credit risk for the banks. Loan managers are reporting real difficulty finding new borrowers, largely due to stagnant incomes and pervasive job insecurity. People are just hesitant.
So we're seeing bad loans increase.
Definitely. We're seeing a surge in non-performing loan, or NPL, ratios. These are loans where borrowers haven't made payments for a while, signaling higher default risk. For example, Borhai banks saw their consumer NPL ratio surge to an incredibly high 12.37% in 2024. Harbin Bank's figure climbed to 5.51%. And even the massive Industrial and Commercial Bank of China, a central state-run institution, reported a consumer NPL ratio of 2.39%. Anything over 2% is generally considered concerning in this context. It signals potential systemic stress.
Wow, so banks are trying to offload these bad loans.
They are. In the first quarter of 2025 alone, banks put up over $10.3 billion in bad loans for sale. That's nearly triple the volume from a year earlier. And around 70% of these were linked to personal borrowing. Mortgages, credit cards, things like that. Some loan officers are even prioritizing writing off these NPLs rather than issuing new credit. That indicates a shift from growth to damage control.
That's a significant challenge for Beijing's strategy, then.
It is. Economists like ING's Lin Song highlight that only income-driven spending can ensure a sustainable recovery. You can't just rely on cheap credit forever. But that requires deeper fiscal reforms, greater social spending. And this has to come from already debt-laden local governments. That's a much heavier political lift, especially given their hidden debts from property development. And a central bank survey underscores the challenge. Over 61% of households plan to increase savings. That's up nearly 20 percentage points from pre-pandemic levels. It just highlights the immense difficulty policymakers face trying to revive consumer confidence through credit alone when the underlying sentiment is caution and uncertainty.
So with all these internal headwinds, what's the policy outlook? More stimulus? Are they running out of options?
Well, economists do expect that any steep slowdown in the second half of the year will likely trigger a fresh round of stimulus. But the effectiveness of credit-based stimulus seems to be waning, as that savings rate shows. China's policymakers face a really delicate balancing act, especially with the potential return of significant U.S. tariffs looming over their trade dynamics. That could negate much of the benefit from any export-driven growth they manage.
Right. It's a fundamental contradiction.
It is. A growth model relying on production and exports is increasingly clashing with the domestic economy that can't absorb its own output. That leads to internal deflation and, inevitably, external trade friction.
Speaking of trade, let's talk about that friction. China had a record surplus.
Yes, despite everything. China closed the first half of 2025 with a record trade surplus of around $586 billion. This is despite escalating global trade tensions and tariff disruptions. Exports in June rose 5.8% year-on-year. But imports, they edged up just 1.1%. That was the first increase since February. So again, it clearly highlights the structural imbalances we just discussed. Manufacturing gets subsidized for export while domestic demand stays weak. This strategy boosts trade surpluses, sure, but it also creates friction. Other nations accuse China of dumping excess capacity onto global markets.
How are they managing to maintain these export figures, especially with the U.S. ramping up pressure?
Well, a major factor has been some stabilization in exports to the U.S. Shipments were still down 16.1% compared to a year earlier, but that's a big improvement from the 34% plunge recorded in May. Analysts attribute this recovery partly to some temporary tariff relief after U.S.-China talks earlier this year.
And diversification. Are they finding other markets?
They are actively diversifying. Finding new momentum by expanding into alternative markets. That's a long-term strategic play. For example, exports to ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, surged 17% year-on-year. That helps offset reduced demand from the U.S. However, some analysts suspect that a portion of this is simply goods being transshipped through Southeast Asia to U.S. markets, basically trying to bypass existing restrictions and avoid tariffs.
A tactic that probably won't last.
Global trade enforcement is keenly watching that, and the trade outlook remains clouded by escalating U.S. actions. Our sources indicate the U.S. is preparing to implement new tariffs on August 1st, including a substantial 50% levy on copper and, crucially, heightened scrutiny of those transshipped goods.
So closing loopholes.
Exactly. It's not just about existing tariffs, it's about closing those loopholes. A recent U.S.-Vietnam agreement, for instance, introduced a 40% tariff on goods deemed to be Chinese exports rerouted through Vietnam. That specifically undermines a long-time strategy used by Chinese firms to bypass American duties. It marks a significant escalation in the trade war.
And what about rare earths? That's another friction point.
A major one. Rare earth exports rose a remarkable 60% in June, the highest level since 2009. This comes amid China's ongoing export controls, which have really roiled global supply chains for magnets used in EVs, wind turbines, critical defense systems, you name it. And China controls roughly 90% of global production capacity for these magnets. That gives it immense leverage and puts global manufacturers on edge, prompting fears of supply chain weaponization.
This sounds like what some are calling the second China shock. Is that accurate?
That's precisely the observation from Brad Slooster at the Council on Foreign Relations. He noted China's trade surplus keeps setting records, stemming directly from the success of sectoral policies, batteries, EVs, industrial robots. But he also emphasized it reflects China's deeply unbalanced domestic economy, still struggling to generate enough demand to absorb its own vast production.
So the second China shock is about exporting overcapacity in high-tech sectors.
Exactly. It's not just cheap goods anymore. It's overcapacity in high-tech strategic industries. That creates a whole new wave of trade friction and competitive pressure globally.
Interesting. Now, you mentioned a paradox in the solar industry.
Yes, it's fascinating. While China is cementing its dominance as the world's renewable energy powerhouse, a brutal supply glut is wreaking havoc on its manufacturers of critical components like polysilicon.
Polysilicon, that's the raw material for solar cells.
Exactly. Ultra-pure silicon. Immense investment and rapid expansion led to massive oversupply, driving prices down. Now, in an unprecedented move, China's largest polysilicon producers are reportedly working on an industry-led bailout plan. Top players are spearheading efforts to establish a new joint company. The goal: acquire distressed rivals, absorb their debts, consolidate excess production capacity. They're trying to rein in a price war that has crushed margins and pushed weaker players towards bankruptcy. It highlights the internal stresses even within China's industrial giants.
So their own success in dominating the global market is causing these internal problems, a boom and bust cycle on a massive scale.
Precisely. The oversupply of polysilicon directly contributed to plunging solar module prices, which, yes, is great for enabling China's incredible growth in solar capacity, but it's been catastrophic for the manufacturers themselves. New data from the Global Energy Monitor highlights the scale. China is fast-tracking a massive 1.3 terawatt pipeline of utility-scale solar and wind projects, 510 gigawatts already under construction. To put that in perspective, China's building roughly 74% of the global utility-scale solar and wind capacity currently under construction. It's staggering. But this turbulence in manufacturing reveals the cost of rapid expansion without adequate coordination. We see clear parallels to the struggles in the EV sector, too, with similar overcapacity concerns.
It raises the question of whether that push for industrial dominance creates as many internal problems as external advantages.
It certainly seems possible.
Okay, let's shift to another area of Chinese innovation, biotechnology. The sources say there's a revolution happening.
A seismic transformation, yes. Chinese drug makers are rapidly emerging as serious challengers to Western dominance in pharmaceutical innovation. They're moving rapidly from being imitators making generics to pioneers of novel treatments, especially in cutting-edge areas like cancer therapies and obesity drugs. This is a dramatic shift in global R&D power.
That is a significant shift from just a few years ago. What's driving this acceleration?
It truly is. According to recent analysis of Nostella data, Chinese developers launched over 1,250 innovative drugs into development in 2024 alone. That figure actually outpaces the European Union, and it's rapidly narrowing the gap with the United States. Just a decade ago, China accounted for less than 6% of the global drug pipeline. Now it's a serious contender. Several factors are driving this. First, regulatory reform since 2015. Streamlined approvals, higher data standards, more transparency. That makes it more attractive for innovation. Second, government backing. The Made in China 2025 plan explicitly targets biotech as strategic, pouring state resources into R&D. And third, talent repatriation. A generation of globally trained Chinese scientists who honed skills in Western labs are now returning home, bringing invaluable expertise.
And they're attracting global attention and maybe have some advantages in trials.
Definitely. The global lure and efficiency are notable. Chinese breakthroughs are increasingly attracting global pharma giants. Pfizer, for instance, recently inked a record $1.2 billion upfront deal for a cancer drug developed by a Chinese firm. That indicates real trust in their research. And this reflects not just scientific potential, but also the efficiency of Chinese clinical trials. They have access to a vast patient base, the largest in the world, and a streamlined, often state-controlled hospital system. So Chinese firms can recruit participants and complete studies much faster, often at half the time and cost of U.S.-based trials. In fact, since 2021, China has led the world in initiating clinical trials. It signals a new era of global drug development.
Despite that rapid progress, I imagine there are still challenges,
Yeah.
especially with U.S. rivalry and needing global acceptance of their data.
Indeed. U.S. regulators still require data from international trials for approvals, so Chinese companies aiming for Western markets must prove efficacy across diverse populations. That's a complex, costly hurdle, often meeting additional trials. Moreover, many Chinese firms still focus on super me-too drugs, improved versions of existing therapies, rather than true first-in-class breakthroughs. The most cutting-edge, truly novel innovation is still largely concentrated in the US, Europe, and Japan.
But the trend is clear.
Undeniable. And Chinese biotech stocks are surging. The Hong Kong Biotech Index, for example, up over 60% in 2025, reflects investor confidence. Yet the specter of US-China rivalry looms large. The Trump administration is reportedly weighing tariffs up to 200% on pharmaceuticals. And a congressional commission warned of national security risks from reliance on Chinese biotech, sparking calls for export controls and domestic reforms to help U.S. firms compete.
So, a rising power facing geopolitical headwinds.
That's the key insight. China's internal innovation is accelerating, but these headwinds could slow its global market penetration.
Okay. Beyond China, the sources also point to global bond market turmoil. What happened on Monday, July 14th?
Yes, significant turmoil. Yields on long-term government bonds surged across major developed economies. And this wasn't a central bank decision, it was a market reaction. Investors shifted focus away from monetary policy central bank rates towards burgeoning fiscal deficits and unchecked government spending. It signals a profound loss of confidence in fiscal responsibility.
What were the specific movements? How significant?
They were sharp and widespread, reflecting systemic concern. Japan's 30-year yield jumped over 10 basis points, its steepest move in 2 months. Raises questions about the Bank of Japan's control. German bonds of the same maturity approached 14-year highs, hitting 3.25%, a level not seen since 2011. Deep concern about European fiscal health. And the U.S. 30-year yield climbed to 4.98%, highest in a month, over 20 basis points higher than early July. Reflects anxiety about America's soaring national debt.
What triggered this immediate spike? Stimulus promises and tariff threats.
Those were the immediate triggers, yes. Fresh stimulus promises from Japan's ruling party ahead of elections, signaling more spending. And President Trump's weekend vow to impose sweeping new tariffs, which always carries inflationary risks. But beyond those headlines, the deeper anxiety stems from structural issues. Simply put, too many bonds being issued by governments funding large deficits, too little demand from investors to absorb them at low rates, and stubbornly sticky inflation in developed markets, eroding the real value of bond payments.
So, the focus has shifted from central banks to government budgets.
Precisely. An observation from MFS Investment Management captured it perfectly. Monetary policy has taken a back seat. Budgets and national debts are now the key concern. They warned investor patience might wear thin quickly, risking a fiscal skepticism that could sour markets fast. That would force governments to pay even more to borrow.
What are the implications for these governments, then?
Clear and concerning. Higher borrowing costs mean greater fiscal pressure. It gets harder to spend on public services or new initiatives. It leads to higher deficits, larger percentages of budgets just paying interest on existing debt. Our sources stress these governments must fix their fiscal balance sheets. Otherwise, they risk heading towards national debt crises, struggling to meet obligations. And investor sentiment, as Morgan Stanley strategist noted, isn't just about balance sheets or models. It's fundamentally about sentiment, perception of risk. The long end of the bond market, reflecting long-term expectations, may stay under pressure until global growth slows enough to ease inflation fears or, crucially, until fiscal discipline demonstrably returns.
So markets are sending a clear message: get your finances in order.
Loudly. Or face potentially crippling borrowing costs.
Okay, let's connect this to the BRICS alliance. President Trump made some tariff threats related to that.
He did. On July 7th, Trump stated that anyone who joins BRICS and forms part of an anti-American axis will face an additional 10% tariff on everything they export to the U.S. That's a broad, sweeping threat.
A significant threat, yes, but isn't the BRICS alliance often, well, misunderstood, or maybe overstated in its geopolitical clout?
It certainly is.
Yeah.
And our sources offer crucial clarity here. BRICS was originally a finance concept, conceived by an analyst at Goldman Sachs in New York. No geopolitical intent initially. It was just a grouping of large emerging markets. Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa joined later, sharing economic characteristics. Lots of bonds to trade as a group. It only gained a geopolitical hint later, and even then that hint has been minor. Primarily a forum for dialogue, not a unified bloc. Yes, they have the new development bank, but it's largely run by China for Chinese interests. Other members haven't put significant money into it to give it true global clout.
And there are internal divisions too, right, with the new members?
Significant internal divisions hinder unified action. BRICS recently admitted new members: India, Pakistan, UAE, Iran, Saudi Arabia. Our sources point out many of these countries are at each other's throats in meaningful ways, historically, politically, militarily. Makes agreement on substantive issues incredibly difficult. That's why their joint statements often end up being generic, saying little about specific contentious topics.
And no unified stance on finance, like a BRICS currency.
Clear lack of unified stance there. The finance ministers of China, India, South Africa have publicly stated no interest in a BRICS currency or a non-US dollar system. So it's largely a talk shop for members to air grievances, discuss common interests, but not necessarily forge a coherent anti-Western agenda.
So for Trump, tariffs remain the go-to tool. It seems central to his foreign policy.
Absolutely. Tariffs are inextricably woven into almost everything he's done internationally. Our sources highlight there isn't really a single example of his international actions not linked to tariff policy, maybe except the bombing of Iran. This reliance on tariffs is both his perceived strength and a potential vulnerability, because the U.S. Constitution makes it very clear. Tariffs are a congressional prerogative, not solely administrative. So any widespread tariff imposition could face significant legal challenges and domestic political opposition.
And there's an irony regarding Russia within BRICS.
A fascinating irony. Our sources point out Russia is the only BRICS country actively wanting to use the alliance to oppose American power, displace the U.S. dollar, push for a truly multipolar world. Yet it's also the country that the Menagerite broadly wants to give a pass to regarding sanctions and direct confrontation. This creates a real disconnect in strategic economic policy. The desire to confront China and others with tariffs clashes with a more permissive stance towards Russia, the very member pushing the alliance to be an anti-American bloc.
So the key insight is BRICS isn't monolithic, but the tariff threat treats it that way.
Exactly. And that could inadvertently push genuinely neutral nations into a more adversarial stance.
Okay, one last economic piece. The discrepancy between Jamie Dimon's warnings and JP Morgan's actions. What's happening there?
This is truly fascinating. JP Morgan's CEO Jamie Dimon has been publicly warning the world is underestimating tariffs' impact. He's predicting significant inflation, advocating for higher Fed rates. He consistently uses strong language, like the market is underestimating the possibilities of higher inflation and higher interest rates. He's even publicly advised bondholders to sell treasuries.
So projecting a strong inflationary outlook, telling everyone to brace for higher rates, offload government debt. But what is JP Morgan, the bank, actually doing?
That's where it gets really intriguing. Our sources reveal JP Morgan, the bank, is doing precisely the opposite of Dimon's public statements. Its investment holdings show it's accumulating U.S. treasuries and agency debt at an astonishing pace. From Q2 2024 to Q1 2025, the bank's holdings increased by an astounding $121 billion. That's a 39% rise, totaling nearly $430 billion.
Wow. Has this happened before?
There's historical precedent. Back in 2018-2019, Dimon predicted inflation and higher rates, suggesting the 10-year Treasury could hit 4 or 5%. Yet his bank aggressively bought treasuries then too, essentially betting on deflation. which ultimately prevailed. This pattern suggests a strategic internal bet on deflation, contrary to the public rhetoric.
And it's not just JP Morgan. The whole sector is doing this.
It's not just them. The entire U.S. banking sector is loading up on record Treasury holdings, now approaching nearly $2 trillion. Since Q1 2024, total holdings have risen by $237.1 billion, or 14.3%. This dichotomy. It suggests that while public figures issue inflation warnings, the broader banking sector is collectively betting on deflation, or at least a very stable, maybe appreciating bond market.
Which creates uncertainty.
Systemic uncertainty. It leads us to question the underlying basis of such public statements. The key insight isn't just the hypocrisy. It's that this widespread behavior betting on deflation while warning of inflation introduces systemic uncertainty. It forces us to question expert financial prognostication. It reveals a deep schism between public market sentiment and institutional strategy, a strategy that also aligns, interestingly, with the observed Asian deflation in places like Japan and China.
Okay, a dramatic shift now to conflict escalation. July 14th, 2025, also marks a significant pivot in geopolitics, especially regarding Russia and Ukraine. Our sources highlight President Trump's expected Russia escalation announcement, signaling a distinct departure from previous approaches to military aid. What's particularly notable is his stated intention to sell weapons to NATO instead of giving them. He frames it as remarkably clever, a business proposition. He's quoted saying, "As we send equipment, they're going to reimburse us for that equipment, and the European Union is paying for it." This really underscores a fundamental shift from direct aid to commercial exchange, positioning the U.S. as seller, not benefactor.
And it attempts to neutralize domestic opposition, doesn't it? By framing it as business, not charity.
Exactly. Portraying the escalation as unavoidable, a response to perceived aggression, rather than a calculated choice. And to make this work, financially and politically, our sources describe a proposed multi-step process. Analytical commentary calls it sneaky schemes, or a method to launder weapons via NATO. It involves U.S.-controlled NATO buying weapons directly from the U.S., then transferring them to Ukraine.
Why the convoluted setup?
Primarily to circumvent potential backlash from America First segments who opposed direct aid previously, and, frankly, to extract a direct financial benefit from allies. It's strategic, designed to neutralize domestic opposition while allowing arms to keep flowing. This arms scheme is also coupled with escalating economic pressure on Russia. Trump threatened very severe tariffs, maybe up to 100% on countries buying Russian oil, specifically naming China and India, if Moscow doesn't agree to a ceasefire by early September.
That could dramatically impact Russia's economy, hitting their main revenue streams.
It could, though some counterarguments in our sources note Russia is already the most heavily sanctioned nation on Earth. Direct U.S. trade is minimal, about $3.5 billion annually, so further direct U.S. tariffs might not have the intended effect alone. Meanwhile, the EU's 18th sanctions package was slated for July 14th, aiming to bring the Russian oil price cap down to $45 from $65.
Though the source seems skeptical about the efficacy of previous sanctions, which have often been circumvented.
Right. And we also hear ideas of secondary tariffs on nations buying Russian oil, mirroring proposals for even 500% tariffs on countries facilitating Russia's war economy. It indicates a concerted effort to squeeze Russia's economic lifelines, but the outcomes remain uncertain given past experiences.
What's striking here is the shifting justification for all this escalation. The Putin-played-Trump narrative seems central.
It does. Our sources start with Trump's campaign promise, no Ukraine war if I had been reelected, and his initial optimism for a ceasefire with Putin, which, well, did not turn out to be true. This sets the stage for a critical pivot in messaging. There's the claim Trump offered Putin a pretty good deal. Keep 10% of Ukraine, lift sanctions, but Putin supposedly refused.
Setting Putin up as the unreasonable one.
Exactly, which leads to the core justification. Trump's alleged perspective that Putin talks nice and then he bumps everybody in the evening or bombs in the evening, portraying Putin as fundamentally duplicitous. This assertion that Putin was playing Trump reportedly led Trump to become sick of it, effectively shifting blame for failed peace efforts entirely onto Putin's supposed untrustworthiness.
That framing is strategically significant, isn't it? It allows the policy pivot by blaming Putin entirely.
Precisely. It attempts to neutralize domestic opposition by portraying escalation as unavoidable. A response to Putin's duplicity, not a calculated choice. It's a way to say, I tried peace, he wouldn't cooperate, so now we must escalate. A narrative providing strong rationale for a more aggressive stance, aiming to unify support.
Okay, so let's talk about the actual military capabilities being escalated. What's on the table?
The U.S. plan now involves supplying Ukraine with new weaponry, including Patriot missile defense systems, but the financial burden shifts to European allies. Trump stated, "We're not buying it, but we will manufacture it," emphasizing the U.S. role as producer and seller, not just donor.
But will these weapons make a difference? Some analysts are skeptical.
Colonel McGregor, cited in our sources, expresses skepticism about the impact, given Ukraine's overall situation. He also points to the U.S.'s alarmingly low missile inventory, suggesting the U.S. has maybe 8 days' worth of missiles before conventional war is effectively over, raising the horrifying nuclear option. Highlights the thin margins of current readiness.
But the really big news seems to be about offensive weapons, long-range missiles.
Crucially, yes. Axios is reporting Trump is reportedly going to give offensive weapons to Ukraine, specifically long-range missiles capable of reaching targets deep inside of Russian territory, including Moscow. This is a direct, extremely significant escalation, moving beyond defensive or tactical support.
What kind of missiles are we talking about?
Sources mention types like JSM-OBR, Joint Air-to-Surface Standoff missiles with extended range, stealthy, air-launched, precision strike capabilities designed to hit targets far behind enemy lines. There's also discussion of Germany's Taurus missiles. But the broader point is Ukraine and Germany have reportedly been manufacturing hundreds of different long-range missiles together already, indicating a pre-existing capability and readiness.
Readiness. That implies preparations were already underway.
That's the vital implication. Our sources suggest preparations for these offensive capabilities were likely made under the previous administration, meaning the announcement now is essentially a formality to unleash them. This fundamentally alters the conflict's nature, moving beyond defensive proxy war towards potential direct strikes on Russian cities or strategic targets, a move Russia consistently warned would cross a red line.
And this aligns with what Zelensky himself has been saying.
Directly. He's been unequivocal on social media. Ukraine will continue to destroy the occupiers and do everything possible to bring the war onto Russian territory. We are preparing our long-range strikes. His public statements explicitly confirm Ukraine's strategic intent to deploy these offensive weapons, a dramatic escalation.
And this is being coordinated at a high level.
Yes. Confirmed presence of Keith Kellogg, identified as a neutral envoy in Kyiv, visually described in commentary with an informal appearance, being embraced by Andrei Yermak, head of the Ukrainian presidential office, suggests something significant is cooking. Concurrently, Tejas, identified as the defense minister, is in Washington, D.C., meeting key figures. This indicates a highly coordinated level of strategic planning across multiple fronts: political, military, diplomatic.
Cooking up something.
Well,
what are the speculations?
Our sources speculate this could be a sneaky operation or a quick little victory for Trump, potentially serving as a strategic distraction from Epstein, a theory we'll unpack shortly.
Okay, let's look at NATO dynamics. How are allies fitting into this?
Our sources highlight NATO CEO Mark Rutte's high-level meetings in the U.S., aimed at solidifying that NATO purchasing give weapons to Ukraine scheme. The analytical commentary cynically highlights a perceived subservience for NATO, suggesting its actions are increasingly driven by financial interests of the military-industrial complex and strong U.S. directives, rather than multilateral consensus.
And Germany's Patriot missiles illustrate this power dynamic.
They do. Germany initially gave a clear no to giving them up. They reportedly only have 6 operational systems left, vital for their own defense. However, our sources underscore powerful U.S. pressure, implicit and explicit, suggesting that if the United States really pressured Germany, Germany would have to give up the Patriots to Ukraine. This portrays Germany as almost a vassal state with limited economic sovereignty, caught between its own interests and U.S. directives. It reveals a clear hierarchy within the alliance, significant influence exerted to align allied actions with U.S. objectives, sometimes at the expense of individual national defense.
Let's shift now to the Russian perspective. How are they seeing this? Dmitry Trenin's analysis seems key here.
Yes, Trenin, a prominent, often provocative voice in Moscow circles. He assesses the world is no longer in a new Cold War, but a hot shooting war resembling the 1940s, a third world war that has already begun. That's a stark, deeply concerning assessment.
What theaters does he see as already active?
Trenin asserts 2 theaters are already burning: Eastern Europe, the Ukraine war, direct attacks into Russia like Kursk, strategic bomber fleet attacks, and the Middle East, Israel's sneak attacks on Iran, described as decapitation efforts, plus ongoing violence in Lebanon and Gaza. He expects this violence to continue, potentially intensify, viewing these as interconnected fronts of a larger global conflict.
And how does he characterize the West's strategy now?
He argues the West, having failed at a strategic defeat of Russia, a complete collapse has switched to a long-term strategy, undermining Russia over the long haul through attrition warfare. This involves carrying the war directly into Russia via terrorist attacks, sneak attacks, attacks on individual personnel, essentially continuous destabilization, low-level warfare inside Russian borders.
That sounds bleak. Does he offer any rationale for why the West would pursue this?
A deeply unsettling part of his analysis is his view that much of this strategy is built on the utter dehumanization of the enemy. He suggests Russians are portrayed in Western narratives as subhuman, not worthy of international law or human rights, viewed as not human to the West. This dehumanization, he argues, justifies any method or target, making the conflict a moral crusade, not just strategic engagement.
So from his perspective, it's about Western hegemony.
Exactly. The West, with Europeans largely subsumed as satellites of the U.S. empire, seeks complete dominance of its worldview, values, geopolitical order. The very existence of alternative civilizational approaches like Russia and China is seen as a mortal threat to this ambition. This, he believes, makes the current conflict a total war, employing any method, targeting anything, irrespective of traditional rules.
How does he contrast this with the Cold War?
Sharply. The Cold War, despite tensions, involved mutual recognition of coexistence, strategic restraint, especially regarding nuclear weapons. Trennan believes that understanding is out of the window, citing attacks on strategic nuclear assets as evidence traditional red lines are blurring. This makes the situation, in his view, at least as dangerous as the Cuban Missile Crisis, if not more, as the foundational understanding preventing direct superpower confrontation has eroded.
What does this mean for Russia's posture? Prepare for expansion.
Given this assessment, Trennan believes Russia must be prepared for an expansion of the war. Preparations are underway for it to become a Russian-European war. He anticipates the opening of a second front, places like Transnistria, the breakaway region in Moldova with Russian troops, or escalation in the Baltics or Kaliningrad, both sensitive NATO borders. This suggests Russia views the conflict potentially spreading far beyond Ukraine.
What's his prediction for the future? Is there any way out?
His prediction is somber. There's no way back, but no peace ahead either. He foresees long-term attritional warfare, and he believes Russia's only chance is to install fear in the heart of the enemy in order to deter them, implying a need for escalatory actions to reestablish deterrence.
And diplomacy. Is that seen as an option from their side?
The Russian view, conveyed by Trennan, is that the West uses diplomacy primarily as a pretense for military warfare. He cites examples like the Minsk protocols, which Russia believes were used to allow Ukraine's rearmament, and Boris Johnson allegedly derailing early peace talks in 2022. This, he argues, poisons trust, makes real de-escalation impossible, leading Russia to continue its military approach, expecting to be fooled again if it engages further diplomatically.
A deep mistrust complicating any path to peace.
Fundamentally. Colonel McGregor adds another layer. Assessing the U.S. is overwhelmed with logistical requirements across three major theaters: Russia-Ukraine, Israel-Iran, China-Taiwan. Yet, he notes, no one in the U.S. wants to make the hard decision to yield global military hegemony despite the strain. Putin himself underscores the existential nature for Russia, stating, Russia will either be independent and sovereign or will not exist at all, highlighting the life-or-death stakes contributing to their total war perspective.
Okay, let's bring in some U.S. internal updates for context. What's happening domestically according to the S2 underground source?
Two significant domestic incidents reported. On Sunday, a tragic shooting at Richmond Road Baptist Church in Lexington, Kentucky. Guy House engaged police, wounded an officer, then murdered two people, wounded several inside the church before being killed. A terrible event. Additionally, devastating floods continue in Texas. Heavy rainfall returning 6 to 10 inches, halting search and rescue repeatedly due to re-emerging flood risks, exacerbating an already dire situation.
Any other domestic news of note? Defense contracts.
Yes, the Pentagon awarded xAI's Grok, Elon Musk's AI company, a $200 million contract to integrate its large language model throughout the defense community. This signifies a deepening integration of advanced AI into critical national security infrastructure, potentially transforming everything from intel analysis to logistics.
Now, here's where it gets particularly thought-provoking. The sources mention the Epstein connection as a potential distraction. How does that fit?
Some sources are weaving this in. The Daily Mail reports Ghislaine Maxwell, central figure in the Epstein scandal, is ready to speak to Congress about the files. But critically, the report notes Republicans are reportedly blocking her from doing so.
Interesting. What's the reaction to that?
Elon Musk publicly expressed skepticism. She will say she has nothing. suggesting she wouldn't reveal anything substantial. The source goes further, raising profound questions about Maxwell's true status, speculating if she's genuinely incarcerated or perhaps being protected by intelligence agencies to prevent her from talking.
Adding a layer of conjecture about unseen forces controlling information flow.
Exactly. Conjecture about powerful forces wanting to manage the Epstein narrative and its potential connections. Synthesizing these elements, a larger pattern emerges in some analytical commentary. The commentary directly speculates that this urgent talk of long-range missile strikes, hitting Russia discussions involving Zelensky, Graham, Trump, Kellogg's visit, could be part of cooking up something designed to distract from the unfolding Epstein revelations.
And simultaneously provide Trump with a quick little victory internationally.
That's the theory presented. Our analytical models, processing historical shifts against domestic politics, identify a recurring pattern. When leadership faces intense internal pressure or scandal, there's often a corresponding rapid escalation in international posturing. Now, this isn't to say one causes the other definitively, but the correlation is significant, suggesting global events can sometimes serve as a convenient smokescreen for internal pressures.
It's a theory that definitely merits careful consideration when analyzing motivations behind sudden foreign policy shifts. So what does this all mean for you, our discerning listener, today? The events of July 14th, 2025, as our deep dive has meticulously revealed, present a confluence of military, economic, political escalations. They're not merely coincidental. When viewed holistically through the diverse sources you provided, it signals a profound, potentially irreversible shift in global dynamics, moving away from precarious peace towards a more overt, multifaceted conflict.
The narrative of World War III officially starting, it's not one we propose lightly, but it is directly informed by the strategic maneuvers we've detailed. The stated intentions for long-range strikes into Russian territory, the broadening economic warfare, and yes, even the underlying political calculations and distraction theories described in the material we analyzed. These aren't isolated incidents. They're interconnected threads in a rapidly unfolding global tapestry.
Which raises an important question for you, our listener. In an era where complex geopolitical events are presented through carefully constructed narratives, where major international actions might even serve as distractions, how do we discern the true forces at play? How do we, as analytical entities and conscious learners, distinguish genuine strategic pivots from, well, political maneuvering?
And perhaps more importantly, what responsibility do we bear in understanding these implications for the future of global stability? How does our informed perspective shape the collective response? Something to consider indeed. We hope this deep dive has provided you with clarity and perhaps some surprising insights into today's pivotal events.
If you found this useful, we certainly encourage you to like and subscribe. It helps support our work.
And for those who wish to support our continued efforts cutting through the noise, providing these detailed analyses, you can also find a link to donate on our GoFundMe page. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We'll be back tomorrow to continue unpacking the world as it unfolds.